You are listening to the Moncrieff Show on Newstalk. Our WhatsApp number is 087 1400 106. Summer, obviously, is a time when humans and the animal world tend to come into a more direct contact with each other, and more insects in the home, for instance. But another creature is being spotted in a lot of Irish households, the grey squirrel. Brendan Higgins is Managing Director of Central Pest Control. Afternoon, Brendan.
Good afternoon, Sean. How are you today?
Not too bad. Now, and so for clarity, it's the red squirrel that's the native species and the grey squirrel that's the invasive species. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Leave the red squirrel alone. They've been reintroduced, I believe, to Killiney to protect them a little bit. The grey squirrel over time, maybe over 100 years in Ireland, has just become that bit more aggressive and threatening, and it's pushed the red squirrel out into other areas. So that's why the red is protected, not the grey. The grey is identified as a pest. Yeah.
Now, and so what would be their motivations for going into people's homes?
Well, if you think about it, the months that they normally breed, roughly December up until about January, it's cold, it's wet, it's miserable. They find somewhere to go for the bed. They may not necessarily be interested in the breakfast, but they'll find a way in through a gap or a ridge tile, set up home, generally in Q1. That's why in our industry we get quite a lot of calls at the first quarter of the year. But then again, a small amount then will start breeding in again this summer. So it's mainly for warmth and shelter, like vermin in general. Yeah. They're fairly similar with their habitats, etc., etc.
And would they be in attics that they're going to stay?
Yes, very much so. You could be up in an attic looking at a rodent job, and you could find different droppings to indicate that basically there's been invasion of the squirrel. What people need to be aware of, especially households, is a loud noise in the attic. Sometimes people say to me, he's got boots on. And, when you hear a call like that in a particular area, it's normally the grey squirrel has found a nice spot to get the insulation, bits and bobs, all together for harvesting zone. So that's normally what happens.
Yeah, and so how many babies would they have at a go?
Good question. Normally their kittens, I believe, is somewhere in around about, I think it's 5 to 7. The female herself, she's in charge. She will live, say, somewhere between 5 and 6 years, where the male will die, they reckon, after 2 to 3 years. So the young kittens, roughly in around about basically, 7 is the norm. Gestation period is somewhere around about the 40 days. And then after that, then 7 weeks approximately later, the grey squirrel baby will be on the move.
Okay. Now, in that, when they're camping upstairs in someone's attic, where are they getting food and that kind of thing? Are they invasive in other senses other than just being noisy?
Well, Mother Nature and wildlife and survival is a wonderful thing, and people say they can't get any food anywhere. However, when you're in a roof-wide attic area, a confined space, you may come across fruit from trees, apple trees, etc., etc. You may come across nuts, especially during COVID. People had been feeding the birds all sorts of goodies, etc., etc. Then they were wondering why the squirrels were moving in. So they will come across nuts and they'll come across fruit, and quite incredibly, they'll find a way into the gap in the roof void, the attic, to store their food as they're getting ready for basically delivery.
Ah, right. And are they how much of an opening, a physical size of an opening does a squirrel need to be able to get into your house?
Yeah, normally you would say to yourself, if you're looking at a size probably maybe of a tennis ball, is that quite sufficient? I've seen them disappear into areas even smaller. People identify the grey squirrel as a big rodent. They're not. They're very, very small. Even if you put them up against a rat, the rat's a big, big guy, where your grey squirrel is quite small. So the gap, really, Sean, doesn't have to be too large. But normally they'll find an easy way from a tree across a branch along by a cable, and then it'll just disappear underneath a ridge tile, or like one of Killiney this morning where basically there was a broken tile. So they're wondering what's happening in the house. When you look out the back, you go onto a roof, you can actually see there's a broken tile. So when people ring you up and say they don't know how they got in, there's obviously a gap. If the gaps are sealed, they won't come in. And Mother Nature's got a lovely way of balancing itself out. If they don't go in, they're wide open to Mother Nature. Foxes will hunt them down. Feral animals will hunt them down, etc., etc. So that's Mother Nature's way of balancing, wildlife, etc., etc.
Yeah. Now, would they be, I mean, a lot of people, if they think, you made a comparison there between the grey squirrel and a rat, most people think, a rat's dirty and maybe aggressive if cornered. Would you say the same thing about a squirrel?
No, I wouldn't. I'm in the pest control industry for about 35, 36 years, and I don't believe I've ever come across the grey squirrel attacking. So I would say at this moment in time, it would be very rare. However, when we're talking about wildlife, and to sidetrack just slightly, people didn't think seagulls were going to move inland and rob your 99 and your ice cream. So it's like at this moment in time, I would say to you, in my experience, and it's only my opinion, that attack is very rare. They should be more afraid of us than we are of them.
Sure, of course. And so are they hard to get rid of?
It's like everything else, we normally get them in cages and you basically bring them very, very, very far away to release them and let them be part of Mother Nature to a degree. But I would always try and help people, first of all. The calls that would come in to Central Pest Control are calls where they're in an attic area, etc., etc. Best bit of advice I could give anybody ringing me up is to say, well, give it a couple of days. They may go out again. And sometimes that happens, Sean. They come in for a couple of days, they go back out again. However, if it's a reoccurring problem, you would say you really need to get the area sealed, proofed. So in other words, chicken wire underneath the ridge tiles. Sometimes you'd see old property in an area where it's surrounded by fields and forests. They'll always have an element of wildlife and the grey squirrel. But if the fascia's missing or something on the roof area is missing, those guys will move in.
Yeah. Are there parts of the country where they tend, there's more of them, so there's a higher, possibility of you having squirrels in your attic?
Well, listen, things have changed, as we know. At one time, you wouldn't see a fox walking up a local housing estate. You wouldn't see squirrels running across the road as you're either going to work or come from work. They've moved in, and a lot of it is, and I've said this before, our waste management has improved so much over the years that the plastic bag, the black bag that used to be out at the back door or waiting for the bin man, it's not happening anymore. So they have adapted, like vermin have adapted. If there's a green bin, it's got a lid on it, or a purple bin, or wherever you are, it might be even a brown bin. So the thing about it is they will find their way to identify a food source and they will survive.
Yeah. If, say, your neighbours have them, is it quite likely you're going to get them?
Yes, very much so. People, if they're having a bit of squirrel activity in their garden, the best thing to do is probably for a couple of neighbours to get together and say, listen, we're seeing a couple of squirrels in the garden. And some people say, it's like everything else, Sean, look at the lovely squirrel until they move in. And the middle of the night or sunrise, they're on the move, they're having their own disco up in the attic. So prevention is always better than cure. So I would always say if they're feeding out amongst the birds, with the bird feeders, etc., etc., they're plentiful during the day, neighbours and people should really have a walk around their property, check their attics to make sure everything is sealed, and that's their way of proofing themselves from the invasion of the grey squirrel.
When they're not moving in with us, where do they normally live?
Well, sometimes you find them in forests and trees and that, like they're a great one to survive. That's why we see less and less in the summer months. And normally even in the times of the winter, when the leaves and all are there, you normally find them in amongst leaves. They've been identified in trees. There's parks out around the south side of Dublin where they're nesting up in the trees and they've gathered all the leaves and they put everything together. So they're great little workers.
Yeah, they are indeed. You got to respect that. Brendan, thanks a million for talking to us today.
No problem. Listen, have a great day, Sean. Take care.
You too. That was Brendan Higgins there, Managing Director of Central Pest Control.